Alaska, 1902. The season was drawing to a close with the inevitability of autumn turning to winter. 5 men, no more than that, though they would have said 5 was quite enough, stood aboard the schooner Mercy, a vessel of modest size but considerable character, preparing for what they believed would be their final haul of the season. The ship lay anchored in Sitka Harbor, with a smell of kelp mingled with coal smoke in a way that spoke of commerce and industry meeting the wild reaches of the North American wilderness. The harbor master had warned them, as harbor masters do. His weathered face creased with the sort of concern that comes from decades spent reading the sea and its moods. The locals, too, those Tlingit peoples who knew these waters as intimately as one might know the corridors of one's own home, had spoken in hushed tones of certain inlets, particularly one on the western side of Prince of Wales Island. They spoke of it as one might speak of a place where one simply did not venture. The word spirits had been mentioned. The word mimicry had been used. These were not casual warnings, nor were they delivered with the nervous superstition of simple folk. These were the hard-earned cautions of people who understood the difference between the sea as men imagined it and the sea as it truly was. Captain Hale, a man of perhaps 50 years, with a sort of face that suggested he'd been carved from the same rock as the cliffs surrounding the harbor, had listened to these warnings with the particular patience that comes from believing none of them. He was a practical man, our captain, a fellow who understood that money lived where fear held sway, and that fear, more often than not, was simply the companion of ignorance. He had a calendar in his head, as I mentioned, one that marked the closing of the cannery with the precision of a ship's chronometer. Weather would not move that calendar. Warning would not move it either. The cannery closed when it closed, and before that day came, a captain who knew his business would fill his hold with halibut and black cod, securing his reputation and his coffers for the season come. I had shipped on smaller vessels in Puget Sound, working my way up from green deckhand to someone the captains trusted with responsibility. But Alaska was new country to me, new water. The chart showed this particular inlet, as though it were simply another fold in the coastline, another opportunity for those with the nerve to exploit it. What the charts did not show, what no chart could truly show, was the quality of the silence that inhabited certain places, or the peculiar emptiness that sometimes surrounded a stretch of water that had learned to be unwelcoming. Our crew comprised 5 souls, an appropriate number for a vessel of the Mercy's modest size. Captain Hale kept the deck organized with the efficiency of a man who'd spent 30 years at sea and intended to spend 30 more without once tolerating chaos. His orders were short, direct, and required no repetition. Petrov, a Russian fellow whose surname was nearly impossible for the English tongue to manage properly, handled the dories and the gaffs with fluidity that suggested his hands had learned their business long before his mind had caught up. He was not a man who wasted motion, and he took pride in knowing that every gesture served a purpose. Then there was Eli, young perhaps by 22 years, having grown up around the sawmills that ringed Tacoma like sentries. He wanted money to send home, as young men do, and the fishing trade offered it in quantities that would have seemed miraculous in the city. Samuel was older than the rest of us by a considerable margin. He might have been 60, or perhaps he was merely one of those men whom the sea ages in particular ways. He was Tlingit, quiet in the manner of those who have learned that listening teaches more than speaking. He marked his hooks by hand, taking a peculiar care with each one as though he were engaged in some form of ritualistic dedication. He never stepped over a coil of line without first lifting it, a practice that struck the rest of us as obsessive until one considered the consequences of a man becoming entangled in his own rope while standing on a pitching deck. Samuel had joined us in Sitka for what he described as a short run, and he'd made a specific request of Captain Hale before we departed, that we follow certain rules if we were to venture into particular coves. He had not, at first, used the word spirits or engaged in any of the mystical language that might have caused a captain to dismiss him entirely. Rather, he had spoken practically, as a man speaks who has learned through bitter experience rather than folklore. Some places, he had said, his English careful but precise, are for passing only, and when you pass, you keep your voice down. You do not fix your eyes on the tree lean. You understand? We had nodded, though I am not certain we had truly understood at that juncture. The first 2 days of our voyage proceeded without incident. We kept to the open water near Craig, setting our lines in productive grounds that any fisherman worth his salt knew. The barrels filled steadily with the day's catch. Good, solid work that spoke to the soundness of our vessel and the competence of our crew. The weather held cold and clear, with a thin wind that dried the decks by midday and allowed us to work without the constant dampness that would, over time, compromise both the wood and the spirit. Ahead of us lay the inlet that Samuel had warned us about, though he had done so in such oblique terms that one might have missed the significance entirely if one weren't paying close attention. From the outside, viewed from beyond its mouth, it presented itself as nothing more than any other inlet along that coast, a clean bite into the shoreline, the sort of geographical feature that existed by the thousand from California to the Bering Strait. There was a long shingle of gravel at its head, scattered with deadfall and the detritus of storms past. A current ran inward at the turn of the tide, pushing rafts of kelp along the edges like shepherds moving their flocks. Gulls circled the outer point in the manner of gulls everywhere, engaged in their endless search for sustenance. But then, and this was the thing that caught my attention, they drifted away. The gulls simply abandoned the point as though the air itself had changed character. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, yet I noted it and said nothing, aware somehow that giving voice to observations in this place would be an error in judgment. We entered at slack water, that particular moment when the tide hung suspended between one direction and another, a brief window of calm that any experienced sailor would recognize as an opportunity. The forest met the beach in what can only be described as a hard line, spruce and hemlock standing so densely that one might have imagined they grew in defiance of any human approach. There were no cabins visible, no columns of smoke suggesting habitation, no canoes resting on the stones, no evidence of traps or stakes that would indicate hunting or harvesting. The shore was empty in a way that tugged at something deep within my chest. Not pleasant, but not immediately fearful either. Rather, it was the emptiness of a place that has learned to be genuinely unwelcoming. I looked for birds on the beach. There were none. I looked for the heads of seals in the channel, alert creatures that typically made their presence known. There were none of those either. The engine coughed once as we set the anchor, a single mechanical protest, and then settled into the sort of irregular idle that suggested even machinery grew reluctant in this place. I watched the strip of cloud catch on the timber and thin out as though the forest itself were drawing it inward, claiming it as part of its domain. The quiet was profound, not the peaceful quiet of a calm day, but something more substantial, almost tangible, as though silence had taken on texture and weight. It was then that Samuel told us the name. This inlet, he said, his voice steady but quiet, belonged to the Kushtaka. He did not raise his voice. He moved to the stove, set a small tin upon it, and poured water over a mixture that smelled sharp, medicinal perhaps, or perhaps something far older and more esoteric than simple medicine. He placed a pinch of this dried substance near the bow, near the stern and at the mast, telling us to step around these small piles as though they were sacred circles, which I suppose they were. "We are guests," he said, "and we should conduct ourselves as guests do, as guests who understand the boundaries of hospitality." He proceeded to outline his rules with the gravity of a magistrate laying down law. Do not whistle. That is the first principle. A whistle is an invitation, you understand? Do not answer voices on the beach, no matter how familiar they might sound, no matter what they might claim. Do not follow anyone who calls your name. He paused, letting these words settle into us. And if something asks for help from the trees, if it calls out that it needs assistance, that it is injured, that it is in danger, we mind our boat. We do not respond. We do not leave the vessel. If we break these rules, the inlet will take the voice we use and return it wrong. It will learn how to speak with our words, but it will not be us speaking them. The captain thanked him with a nod and then, without further comment, gave out the day's assignments. He had no patience for stories at the commencement of a fishing set. Captain Hale. These were practical men engaged in practical work, and sentiment had no place in the calculation of profit and loss. We lowered the two dories and took our lines away from the anchor, moving out to where the water deepened significantly. The bottom fell away beneath us. Green at first, then black as the depth increased. The hooks dropped out of sight, and the line slid through my hands with that peculiar coldness that only comes from salt water in northern regions. We set the first long line, and then a second closer to the head of the inlet, the gravel there smooth and unmarked by any recent disturbance. I kept my attention on the tree lean, watching for movement, though I could not have said what manner of movement I expected to see. The smell emanating from the shore was wrong, as I noted before. Not decay, precisely, though there was something in it that spoke of decomposition occurring at a fundamental level. Not flowering or growth, either. It had no real substance to it, no body, as though it were a smell that existed more as a concept than as an actual property of the air itself. We returned to the Mercy before sundown, seeking the warmth of the stove and the comfort of hot coffee. We ate with our wet clothing steaming around us, and for a time we allowed the quiet to settle over us like a blanket. It was Eli who broke the silence, his young voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that seemed almost disrespectful in that place. "What is the Kushtaka?" he asked. "Precisely, I mean, what are we meant to fear?" Samuel set down his cup with deliberate care. "The land otter," he said. "It is called Kushtaka in the old language. It takes men who walk alone at the edge of water, at that boundary between the solid world and the liquid one, where a man cannot be wholly certain of which realm he belongs to in that moment. It can appear as a man you know, someone you would recognize and perhaps trust, or it can appear as a woman you cannot turn from, a figure so compelling that you will become secondary to your desire, or it might be a child who needs your help, who reaches out and asks for your hand." He paused, allowing these images to settle into our minds. "It takes a voice," he continued. "Once it has your voice, it learns your step, learns your manner of moving through the world, and then your ways do not hold you anymore. You belong to the inlet rather than to yourself." The captain rolled himself a cigarette with careful precision, the paper crackling in his weathered hands. "Sleep," he instructed us, "and keep the anchor light burning high. I'll take first watch." I lay in my bunk with my boots still on my feet and my oilskin folded at my side. The Mercy moved gently, just enough to keep the awareness of water present in one's mind, that subtle rocking that reminds a sailor that he is, at all times, balanced precariously between one element and another. I slept, though my sleep was a shallow, unsettled kind that comes when the body is tired but the mind refuses to settle. I woke to the sound of a single knock upon wood, deliberate, measured, not the random percussion of a wave against the hull. Then another, spaced evenly, suggesting intention rather than accident. I sat up, my heart suddenly loud in my own ears. The cabin was dark. The stove had burned down to coals, casting only the faintest glow across the wooden planks. The knock came again, closer this time, and then a voice emerged from the darkness beyond our vessel. It was a woman's voice. It said, "Hello," slowly and with great care, as though the speaker would try out the word for the very first time, testing in the world to see how it fit. Then it said my name, my actual name, not a guess, not a common appellation, but the specific name by which I was called in the world beyond this place. This was impossible. I had not told my name to anyone in Sitka beyond the harbor clerk and Captain Hale. Yet here was his voice, feminine and measured, calling me by name. It called again, and then it asked for a rope. Captain Hale appeared in the hatchway, as if summoned by my shock. He stood in the darkness and stared toward the shore, toward the beach from which the voice emanated. His face was unreadable. Petrov rose and reached for his coat, moving with the intention of someone about to take action. Samuel, however, set a hand upon his arm and shook his head once, a gesture so firm and so loaded with meaning that Petrov ceased his movement immediately. Eli stood at the ladder with his mouth open, uncertain whether to climb or descend. The voice continued its work. It called for the captain, then spoke his full name in the correct order, with a precise accent and emphasis that suggested absolute familiarity. It told him that someone had fallen into the water, that this person could not feel their legs, that they were drowning or nearly so. It described a rock on the north shore, a rock that Petrov, standing there in the darkness, immediately recognized. He whispered that he knew the rock, that it was exactly as described, and he lifted the oars with the intention of launching the dory into the night. Captain Hale lit the anchor light to its full brightness and turned the lens toward the shore. The beam ran along the stones and struck nothing, no figure, No struggling person, no evidence whatsoever of any genuine distress. Yet the voice moved, now closer to the mouth of the inlet, then back toward the head, always maintaining a position just outside the reach of the light. It used the same words over and over. "Please come. Someone is drowning. Please help us." None of us answered. I kept my mouth closed, breathing through my nose, because my tongue felt impossibly heavy, as though my body refused to cooperate with any attempt to form words. After a considerable time, the voice stopped, but a new sound emerged from the beach, the clatter of stones underfoot, yet with a rhythm that was decidedly wrong. A steady gait was not suggested. Rather, the sound came in short bursts, then a pause, then a quick scramble, then silence. The pattern repeated, suggesting movement that followed no human logic. I did not see anything in the light. The captain expanded the beam slightly, tried to illuminate more of the shoreline, but the sound died away, leaving only the smell of hot oil from the lamp mixing with that peculiar scent from the shore, that smell without substance, without body. My hands ached from holding still. We stood there through the hours until dawn finally broke, thin and reluctant, across the water. When morning came, we discovered that the tide had receded further than expected, exposing additional gravel that had not been visible the previous evening. We rowed out to the first line with a sense of dread that none of us articulated. The hooks came up in steady rhythm initially, suggesting a night of good fishing. Yet then they became tangled. The gang lines crossed at angles that our hands had not created. Knots we had not tied cinched themselves tight around the main line. Petrov cursed in Russian, a long, elaborate curse that suggested genuine distress, and he cut the line free with sharp strokes. Every fifth hook came up empty, and when I examined one of these bare hooks, I found it polished smooth as though hands had worked the barb. Every single one. The fish we had managed to retrieve bore small, straight cuts in their skin, narrow, clean incisions that no tooth could have made, no ordinary blade could have inflicted with such precision. I looked back toward the beach and found no birds moving along the rock line. No tracks showed where the new stones lay exposed. We proceeded to the second line positioned near the head of the inlet. The float marking its location was not where we had left it. It had drifted toward the shore, or been drawn toward it, which seemed far more likely given what we had already witnessed. We pulled on a line and found it wrapped around a rock by 3 full turns. This was a crucial detail. We had left that rock marked at 4 fathoms depth. The flood tide, while strong, would not possess the strength necessary to drag our gear to such a position. Something had moved it deliberately, or something had deliberately positioned itself to make such movement occur. Petrov set his jaw and worked quickly, refusing to look toward the trees. Eli glanced in that direction more than once, and I instructed him to keep his attention on his feet, on the immediate task at hand. On the road back to the Mercy, Eli pointed toward the beach on the north side, where a shape stood at the very edge of the tree-line. It had the height of a man and the posture of an animal ready to collapse onto all fours, that tense, suspended moment before a creature launches into motion. It did not move whilst we watched. It had a pale face and considerable darkness around the eyes. Not shadows precisely, but a quality of emptiness, as though the eyes were not simply dark, but genuinely hollow. I wanted to call out, to demand explanation or clarification, but the echo of the night's voice still sat heavy upon my tongue, and I found myself unable to articulate anything at all. Samuel did not turn his head. He fixed his attention upon our vessel and kept the oars moving with mechanical precision. When we reached the Mercy, he informed Captain Hale that we would be finished in this place by tomorrow, hold full or not. "Not yet," the captain said, and I heard in his voice the particular stubbornness that comes from a man who has committed himself to a course of action and does not intend to deviate regardless of circumstance. "One more set. The fish are here. I can feel it in my bones." Samuel did not argue, though I saw something pass through his expression, a flash of concern or perhaps resignation. He went below and emerged with a small bag, which he hung by the door of the cabin with explicit instructions that none of us were to touch it. "Keep our voices on deck to a minimum," he said. "Speak only to the person you face directly. Eli, tie your boots with a new knot, something different for what you normally do. Do not leave them on the beach. We will be safe if we stay together and keep to the water that we know. The day passed without wind, which felt unnatural in those waters. We set 2 more lines and watched the inlet carefully for any sign of disturbance. At midday, I observed something moving beneath the surface near the stern, not the characteristic stroke of a seal moving through water, but something that suggested a human swimmer with purposeful intention. It maintained pace with our hull for approximately 20 strokes, moving with deliberate motion, and then it simply vanished beneath us. The barge remained dry. The hull felt sound. I said nothing of what I had seen, because I was becoming increasingly aware that to give voice to these observations would be to make them real in a way that silence prevented. By late afternoon, fog crept in from the mouth of the inlet. This was not the sort of fog that gradually accumulates, but rather a fog that simply arrived, as though someone had drawn a curtain across the world. It did not roll or move in any organic manner. It simply stood there, thickening around us, obscuring the tree-line, and making the head of the inlet seem far closer than it actually was. Sound changed fundamentally. We could hear our own breath, the drip of water from the boom, and very little else. The captain announced that we would retrieve our lines at first light and depart. He posted watches and instructed us to keep the lamp burning high. We ate in small quantities and cleaned our knives, arranging them in a careful row beside the stove. Eli asked for a story, anything really, to break the mounting tension. Samuel replied, "No story, only rules. Do not whistle, do not answer, do not walk alone." Near midnight, the fog drew itself so tightly around the Mercy that we became completely isolated from shore. It was then that I heard water slapping against the hull with a rhythm that was distinctly not natural wave action. It had a pattern to it, a deliberate percussion. Slap, pause, lighter touch, pause. Repetition suggesting intention. Petrov went on deck, and I followed, uncertain whether I was offering support or seeking it. We stood by the rail and simply listened. And then, from approximately 10 yards distant, a whistle sounded, the call that men use to signal one another in heavy fog. A reply came from the opposite direction, 10 yards on the other side, matching the pattern precisely. Then a third whistle rose from ahead of the inlet, also matching the pattern. The sound began to move, to circle us, until it surrounded us completely. My chest felt tight. I wanted to call out, to break the pattern with a shout, to do something to interrupt the rhythm that was growing increasingly claustrophobic. But I did not. The captain raised a lamp higher, and the fog reflected the light back into our faces, blinding rather than illuminating. When the whistling finally ceased, something brushed against our rudder with enough force to shake the tiller. Petrov grabbed and swore, not at the water, but at his own hands for nearly losing control. The lamp swung wildly, showing nothing but wet air and shadow. Another knock came from the bow, low and deliberate, and it continued for what felt like an eternity but was probably merely a minute. Then silence returned, that absolute and terrible silence that we had come to dread. We stood there until dawn finally broke. In the light of morning, we discovered that one of our dories had gone adrift. Its painter, the rope securing it to the Mercy, had been cut cleanly through, leaving a smooth end rather than a frayed, damaged end that would have resulted from breakage due to strain. Inside the boat, we found 2 hooks and a coil of line tied in a pattern none of us recognized. Petrov lifted the rope and then set it down immediately, as though it had been heated. The captain's voice was calm when he spoke. "We will retrieve our gear and depart. The inlet does not wish us here. I think we have all come to understand that clearly enough." I felt the same. The inlet did not want us. I could feel this with a certainty that transcended logic or rational explanation. There was an intention to this place, an agency, a will that actively worked against our presence and our prosperity. We rowed out to the first float, only to discover that it was gone entirely. Only the thin stick remained, bent and pointing directly toward the trees. We hauled on this stick, and it came free with no weight whatsoever. The line had been cut below the first fathom. The second set lay where we had left it, but when we pulled it in, every single hook rose empty and gleaming, as though someone had methodically rubbed each one with stone, removing any trace of bait or blood or scent. Halfway through hauling the second line, a voice called from the fog near the mouth. It was a woman's voice, and Eli's face went white. The voice was unmistakably his mother's voice. The specific cadence of her speech, the particular way she pronounced certain words, the gentle quality that he had heard throughout his childhood. He dropped the line and stepped toward the rail, drawn by a compulsion that transcended conscious thought. Samuel grabbed the collar of his coat and spoke his name once in a tone that a father might use when a boy reaches toward flame. Eli stopped, blinked as though waking from a dream, and looked down at the deck. He would not lift his eyes again for some considerable time. I said nothing. I kept pulling the line, hook after hook, each one empty and gleaming in the thin light. The inlet had handled each piece we had put into it. We turned toward the anchor with a sense of urgency that overrode all other considerations. The tide had begun to fall significantly. Stones showed at the head of the inlet, and on these stones lay a row of fish in a neat, deliberate line, all facing toward the forest. They were not ours. Their eyes were open and clear. No gulls came to them. No flies gathered. The sight put a cold behind my ribs that no quantity of clothing could have touched. The captain stood straight, lifted his chin toward the fog, and then lowered again. "Heave for the anchor," he commanded. "Now." No one argued. We made for the mouth of the inlet in silence, keeping our eyes focused on our immediate work rather than on the landscape surrounding us. The wind had failed entirely, leaving us dependent upon the engine and the tide. As we approached the mouth, the fog sat low and kept the shoreline hidden at approximately 50 yards distance. I watched the compass whilst Petrov held the tiller, and Samuel kept a hand on Eli's shoulder, grounding him in the present moment. The captain stood near the bow, calling depths as the lead line touched bottom in places where the chart suggested no such bottom should exist. According to our charts, the mid-channel should have been 15 fathoms deep. We were taking soundings at 8, then 6. Something had shifted the bottom, or something had moved us off the safe course without our knowledge or consent. I kept my voice to the minimum necessary, reading bearings using only words that served the immediate purpose. I did not want to offer more sound to this water, more presence, more of myself. The tide turned before we reached the point where the inlet opened into open water. We felt it first through the hull and then saw the surface take a slow, deliberate pull inward. The captain told us to drop a second anchor to hold our position whilst we took soundings. Petrov, and I let it go and paid out line. The current tugged the hull sideways, and the bow swung north toward the tree-line, where it remained, straining against both anchor lines. We were pinned. The engine gave a steady thrum, but the hull did not advance. The mouth was near, so tantalizingly close, yet we could not make forward progress. We worked the lines for an hour, without gain. The lead showed us uneven bottom with sudden rises and unexpected drops, a geography that bore no resemblance to the charts we carried. The captain did not shout, which told me that his thinking had fundamentally changed. He stripped off his coat and worked the windlass with his full weight, his face set in an expression of absolute determination. I felt my arms buzzing from the exertion. Eli fetched water for our hands, then sat down the dipper and stared at the fog as it parted momentarily, revealing a low shelf with drift logs stacked like bones, an image so horrible that he made a sound in his throat before catching himself. Samuel told him to keep his breathing slow and not to search for shapes in the mist or the shadows. It was then that a voice rose from a fog off our stern. I recognized it immediately. It was my sister's voice from Tacoma, complete with particular hits she had when she laughed, that specific inflection that had been part of my life since childhood. After laughing, she asked me to help her carry a box from a wagon. I had not heard that sound in 2 years. It landed in my chest with a kind of heat, and my hands suddenly loosened, my grip on the anchor line becoming slack. But I caught myself. I forced my hands to tighten. I kept staring at the wrap on the anchor line, and named each step of the lash turns in my head, as though I were teaching a green deckhand the proper technique. The voice asked a second time, and then used a word, a specific word, a word that only she and I use at home, a private thing, a thing between siblings that existed nowhere else in the world. I said nothing. The captain set his jaw. Samuel was watching me. He nodded once when I did not answer, an acknowledgement that I had passed some crucial test. Eli moved as if to step toward the rail, but Samuel shifted his weight and blocked him without force, speaking his name in the tone a father might use when a boy reaches toward flame. Another voice answered from the north side, the old clerk from the Sitka office, his voice exact in cadence, calling out a tally of casks and rope as though he were reciting the inventory from a week prior. Then a third voice began singing from the head of the inlet, something low, with no words I recognized, only tone and breath, not like any song I had heard from men on boats. The notes matched and paced a slight push and slack of the current, moving in synchronization with the tidal rhythms. I saw Petrov's hands go still on the tiller. He blinked and looked at the deck and started again, like a man who has suddenly remembered an important rule. We tried to haul the weather anchor. The line came up tight, then paused. I felt the scrape along the hawse hole through the rope. Petrov and I hauled with all our strength. Something let go with a shake that traveled the entire length of the Mercy. The anchor broke free, carrying with a length of weed I did not recognize. It was not kelp. The fronds were thin and flat, and they carried small round pods that clicked against a rail as the anchor was hauled aboard. Samuel took a stick and pushed the weed overboard without allowing it to touch his hands. He did this without comment, but the act itself was significant, a gesture suggesting that he recognized the nature of what we had retrieved. The pods made a hollow sound as they struck the water and then sank fast, far faster than anything composed of vegetable matter should sink. We pointed the bow again toward the mouth and advanced 3 boat lengths before the current caught us and held us once more. The fog thinned momentarily, and I saw 2 low rocks I did not know, bare and wet, exactly where the chart showed no obstruction whatsoever. The captain stared at them hard, and then looked at the chart, as if it might somehow change in his hands. He folded it once and put away. "Bear a little more to starboard," he ordered. "Take another try." We did and gained 2 lengths, though my arms now felt impossibly heavy, and my shoulders burned with intensity that suggested genuine damage. But I said nothing that was not immediately work-related. The captain demanded this of us now. Speech that was not functional, not directly related to our survival and escape, would be a luxury we could no longer afford. Just as we started to gather way toward the mouth, a crack sounded from forward. The hawpipe shuddered. The bow anchor line jerked and went completely slack. The captain lurched and then caught himself. We hauled fast. The line came up cleanly cut at a bias near the splice, not parted from strain. The edge was too smooth, too perfect. No natural force in the world would have created such a cut. The captain stared at the end for a long moment, and then laid it down with care, as though rapid movement might provoke something. He looked at Samuel. Samuel's face did not change, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We could still move. The loss of the anchor made us lighter, but it also gave the current more purchase. The hull drifted 5 feet to port with no order from the helm. Petrov swore under his breath, not at the water, but at his own hands for allowing the drift to occur. Eli went to the rail and heaved. He was white around the mouth and lips, his entire frame trembling. I wanted to tell him that we would be out in an hour, that escape was achievable, that the worst would soon be behind us. I did not speak it. I kept working. By mid-morning, the fog broke enough that we could see the mouth clearly. It was narrower than it had appeared from inside the inlet, and a set of stones created a pattern that resembled a gate, a deliberate entrance, suggesting intention and design. I had not noticed this before, though I should have. The water inside the gate lay smooth and glassy. Outside the gate, the surface showed ripple lines from a small swell. The distinction was so clear, so absolute, that it felt like standing at a threshold. I thought of stepping through a doorway and felt a pressure at the back of my neck. The captain called the helm to hold our course against a slide to port. We pushed forward with steady power. The hull nosed into mouth and then checked as though pushed from the side. I saw a disturbance on the water off the starboard bow. Not wind, not current, but something that resembled hands pressing up from beneath and then letting go. The surface grew domed, then fell flat. The bow slewed to starboard. Petrov fought the tiller. It bucked under his palms. The Mercy slid toward the north rock with slow, terrible certainty. The captain ordered ahead again, his voice low and firm. The engine answered. We missed the rock by perhaps a yard and scraped something just below the surface with a sound like a thick rope being drawn across a wooden beam. The hull shivered. Then we were through the gate and into the outer swell. Relief rose in me like heat pouring into frozen limbs. The air felt different, tasted different. I tasted salt cleanly again, without the overlay of that peculiar scent that had permeated the inlet. We let the current take us 30 yards, and then began to shape a course for genuinely open water. That was when Petrov pointed aft. The dory we had been towing was gone. The tow line trailed with a clean angle across the stern and a frayed end, as though small pulls had worried it over time. Eli said he had checked it at the mouth. He looked genuinely sick. We could not go back. To turn the Mercy broadside into that set of stones would have been suicide, and not one amongst us possessed either the desire or the courage to suggest such a course. The captain stared long at the missing boat, his jaw working as though he were grinding something between his teeth. Then he told us to keep going, to maintain our course and our speed, and to not speak of the dory again. We made for a low point west of the inlet, and eventually came under the lee of a small island covered in brush. The swell eased. The fog thinned further, then tore away in strips, revealing the sky in patches of gray-blue. I looked back toward the place from which we had escaped. The entrance to that inlet did not present itself as it had from within. From this external perspective, it looked like a seam in the coastline, a fold in the geography that did not wish to be observed, that seemed to actively resist scrutiny and attention. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in what felt like days, though only hours had truly passed. I turned my face toward the steam rising from the galley and thought of hot coffee and bread, of normal things, of the return to ordinary existence. But we did not get that comfort immediately. A shape came out from behind the small island. At first, I thought it was a stump, a piece of driftwood perhaps, pulled by the tide and the current. Then it changed course across the swell in a manner that suggested deliberate navigation rather than passive drift. It was a dory. I saw our paint on the gunwale. The oars lay in the locks, feathers up, blades skimming the water with each small rise and fall of the waves. No one sat on the thwarts. It bore down on our starboard quarter at a pace equal to our own, though we were under power. The tow line on our stern, the line we had cut when the dory first went missing, trailed into the wake and then suddenly tensed. The end of the lost rope lifted and met the dory's bow like two hands finding each other in absolute darkness. The line made half a hitch around the small cleat on the bow by itself and went taut, and then the dory settled into our wake without any bump or collision or any sign of resistance. Eli made a sound that was not a word, something between a gasp and a whimper. Petrov went pale, his face taking on the color of spoiled milk. I felt my stomach pull tight, and then I took the helm from Petrov because his hands had begun to tremble so violently that I feared he would lose all control. Samuel stepped to the stern and reached for the line. He stopped an inch short and drew back as though the rope might burn him. "We will not touch the rope until noon," he said to the captain. "We will keep our course and not look behind us for 100 heartbeats. Do you understand?" The captain looked like a man faced with a choice between running ground and deep water. He nodded once, though the gesture seemed to cost him something. We all looked ahead and counted in our heads without saying it aloud. I kept the compass needle steady. The dory rode behind us like a well-trained dog, following perfectly, moving exactly as we moved. I forced that thought away because I did not want to set that image in my mind with any word that might make it closer, more real, more genuine. At noon, on open water with a steady swell, and the shore a mile distant, we slowed. Samuel told us to throw a spare block into the dory. It landed on the seat with a heavy knock. The boat did not shift or rock. He had me coil a new length of dry line, and he spliced it to the tow rope. The old rope had taken on a dark sheen that I did not particularly like, a color that suggested age or corruption or both. He cut the splice with a clean stroke and let the old end fall into the sea. It sank at once instead of floating as rope ordinarily would. I did not speak about that. I had learned by this point that some observations were better left unvoiced. We towed the dory to a safe anchorage 2 hours distant and moored under a bluff with a wind coming from the west. The ordinary sounds of the normal cove met us. Birds calling, water slapping in a manner I recognized, the smell of spruce reaching us across the air. I felt like myself again for the first time since we had entered that inlet. We brewed coffee and ate hard bread with fish salted from before the voyage. Eli would not drink until Samuel had sipped first, which I did not judge but rather understood completely. The captain spread the chart and marked the inlet with a pencil stroke, then covered the paper with his palm as though to hide it from view. His shoulders showed strain I had not seen in him before, the particular exhaustion that comes from confronting something that transcends the normal parameters of experience. Petrov wiped his hand with a rag and threw it away, an act of finality suggesting he wished to be rid of something contaminated. We discussed our options. The captain wanted one more haul along the outside of the island chain to make up for the lost day. Samuel said he would go with us, but we would not pass that inlet again. He asked the captain to say this, to make a formal declaration, a commitment rather than a casual statement. The captain said it in a low tone like a man swearing in court. We will not pass that mouth again. That eased something between them. I did not know if the inlet would be content with that promise or not. I kept the thought to myself, aware now that speaking about it would give shape in this new cove, and I wanted this place to remain ordinary, to resist contamination. We took stock of our gear. The lines looked serviceable except for the one splice. The hooks we had left from the first sets lay clean and ready for use. The engine ran smooth. These small signs steadied me considerably. I told myself we had left the worst behind, that the ordeal was over. That conviction lasted until I noticed that the small bag Samuel had hung by the cabin door was no longer there. Samuel did not react dramatically. He looked once at the empty nail and then closed the door. He did not mention it in front of the captain. Later, when I went on deck to rinse a cup, he joined me and spoke so quietly I barely heard him. "We will keep watches through the night," he said. "We will not answer any voice, no matter whose it is or where it comes from. Not from the water, not from the shore, not from above. Do you understand?" I told him he had my word. We set the anchor and made a small fire in a pan on deck to dry gloves. The light fell clean across the bay. A raven flew over and landed on the bluff and called 3 times, a sound so normal, so utterly ordinary, that it felt like a benediction. I let the knot in my back ease slightly. Eli stood near the bow and looked at the sound. He seemed more solid again, though his eyes still moved too rapidly, still searching for threats. He asked me about my sister. I told him 2 plain things, and nothing more. We did not speak of the dory tying itself or the voices pushing at our ears. The captain inspected the splice again and then went below to write in his small logbook, a habit I had never noticed before, but which now seemed essential, a way of making record, of creating evidence that these things had actually occurred. Petrov scrubbed the deck out of habit. These acts felt like a bridge back to our lives, to the normal patterns of work and rest that had sustained us before we entered that place. An hour before dusk, we heard a single whistle from beyond the point. It was the call men used to find each other in fog. It came again with the same spacing as before. I felt the blood leave my hands. This was not that inlet, but the sound had followed us as surely as the dory had. The captain stepped out of the cabin and looked at Samuel. Samuel did not blink. He said we would lower the dory and row to the beach to see if any trap stakes or driftwood might be creating the echo. He said we would keep together and not answer. The captain agreed, though I saw the hesitation in his face. I did not like leaving the Mercy, but I wanted answers more than I wanted to sit under that whistle, more than I wanted to remain trapped in uncertainty. We lowered the dory and pulled for the small shingle under the bluff. The water was clear. I saw bottom at 10 feet. No weed moved there. No fish slipped aside. The only sound was the creak of our oars. The whistle sounded again, now from near the mouth of this cove. When we reached the stones, we pulled the dory above the wash and stood with our boots on firm ground. The whistle stopped immediately. A footstep sounded behind the drift logs. One step only, deliberate and measured. We waited in absolute silence. Then something stood up from behind the largest log. It had the outline of a man, but the head shape of an otter, the skull structure distinctive and unmistakable. The proportions fundamentally wrong for any human being. Its eyes were set too far apart. The mouth did not move when it spoke in a voice I knew. It used the captain's father's voice, a voice from Connecticut, from a place and a time that none of us had ever experienced, a voice that Captain Hale had not heard in decades. It asked for a hand with a net, and then it shifted its weight, and the wet fur around its jaw showed in a way that turned my stomach. It was watching our mouths, not our eyes. The captain's face went a color I had not seen on him before, a kind of gray-green that suggested his body was shutting down in preparation for something catastrophic. He reached for the boat hook. Samuel lifted his hand and set it on the captain's forearm. "No," Samuel said. He told the thing that we had no spare hands and that we were leaving. He said in his own tongue, in Tlingit, and the precision of the words suggested ritual, ceremony, wait. The thing tilted its head in the way a dog does at a new sound. Then it spoke in Samuel's voice and asked me by name for a rope. My legs felt unsteady. I took one step back and set my heels hard into the gravel. Petrov crossed himself, which I had not seen him do before on any deck. Eli looked ready to run, but there was nowhere to run except the dory and the water. The creature stood no more than 10 yards from us. The tide hissed against the stones, drawing a thin foam line that reached the tips of his feet and pulled away again. The air around it smelled of wet hide and something sour, like fish left in a net too long. It did not blink. I could see the steady lift of its chest, the small flecks in the hands that hung at its sides, the dark claws curving in toward the palms. When it spoke again in Samuel's voice, the words came slower, as though it were searching for the rhythm. Samuel answered in Tlingit, a short phrase that sounded like a warning or a dismissal. The creature tilted its head, gave a low sound that was neither growl nor breath, and took one step closer. Eli moved back, stumbling on the loose stones, and the dory scraped against the beach. The sound made the creature stop. Its nostrils widened, and the eyes shifted to the boat as if recognizing something it wanted. Petrov whispered that we should move now. The captain gave a slight nod, his hand tightening around the boat hook. We backed toward the water in small steps. The creature stayed where it was, but kept its eyes on us. Samuel murmured a word under his breath for each step we took, a rhythm to keep us together, a counter-rhythm to the creature's presence. When the surf reached our boots, Samuel said one last word and turned sharply. We shoved the dory out and climbed in fast. Eli slipped but caught the gunwale. Petrov pushed off, and I pulled at the oars until my shoulders ached intensely. The water between us and the shore widened, and still the creature stood there motionless except for the slow turning of its head to watch us. It raised one hand and waved once, a small gesture, and then crouched low to the ground. The motion was smooth, utterly fluid, not human in any way. Then it was gone, slipping into the dark stones without a sound. We rowed until the Mercy's hull shadowed us. The captain didn't speak. He only pointed to the ladder and went up first. Samuel came last and turned once before stepping aboard. I followed his eyes but saw nothing behind us except open water and gray light. We hauled the dory in and lashed it tight, triple turns on the cleats. Samuel checked every knot himself. When he finished, he looked down at his hands for a long time, then rubbed his palms against his coat as if washing them clean. The captain told us to weigh anchor before dark. None of us argued. The wind shifted from west to east, and we took it as a sign to leave. I could feel a pressure in my ears, a kind of humming that eased as we moved farther out. The island dropped behind us, and the water began to show long swells again. For the first time in what felt like weeks, gulls followed our wake. Their cries sounded harsh but welcome. By the time night came, the coast was only a line of black to starboard. The captain set our course south toward Craig. He said we would stop at the cannery for repairs and report the inlet as unsafe due to shifting bottom. He didn't mention what we had seen, and no one asked him to. We took our watches quietly. Eli stayed close to the stove, shivering though the air was not cold. Petrov wrote in his small notebook, a habit I hadn't noticed before. Samuel sat at the table with his eyes closed, moving his lips without sound. I took second watch. The sea lay calm except for the swell under the bow. Stars broke through the cloud cover. The regular pattern of the waves steadied me, and I found myself almost believing the day had been a dream made from fatigue. I heard the soft creak of the rigging, the lap of water against the hull, the faint hum of the engine. Nothing else. I stayed that way for an hour before I noticed a change in the sound of the tow line. It had gone slack. I leaned over the stern. The dory was gone again. The rope trail behind us snapped cleanly near the splice we had made that morning. I froze. The captain came on deck, following my gaze. He saw the line and didn't curse or shout. He only said, "Leave it." Then he looked back at the sea and added, "We won't look for it this time." At dawn, the weather turned rough. A low wind rose from the north, pushing the sea into short, steep waves that slapped the hull with genuine force. We rigged storm canvas and tied down what we could. The captain stayed at the helm. Spray soaked the deck, and we worked through it, tired but alert, driven by an understanding that any lapse in attention could prove fatal. Around mid-morning, the compass began to twitch. The needle swung 5 degrees off course, then steadied, then jumped again. Petrov checked the housing for magnet loss. Nothing appeared wrong. The metal was clean, the glass clear, but the needle refused to hold true north. We relied on the landmass when we could see it, and on the captain's sense of water when we couldn't. By noon, the storm passed as quickly as it had come. The sea went glassy again, and the wind died altogether. The sky held no color, only flat gray. The calm felt worse than the wind, pressing down as though the weather were waiting, holding its breath. I went to the bow to coil a loose line and saw movement in the water ahead. It wasn't a fish or a wave. It was something just below the surface, pacing our speed. It had the outline of a man swimming on his side, arms close to the body, head low. I called for the captain. He came forward and saw it too. We watched it drift nearer until it passed under the bow. The wake behind us rippled once, then smoothed. Samuel said the name again, Kushtaka. He touched the rail once for luck. The captain ordered full speed until the coast came into view. The engine strained, but we pushed through the flat calm until mountains rose ahead. By late afternoon, we found a small harbor and set anchor among other fishing boats. I had never been so relieved to see smoke from cabin chimneys. We tied off and made for the dock. When we reached shore, the harbor master came down to meet us. He asked if we'd been in the inlet north of Prince of Wales. The captain hesitated, then nodded. The man frowned. "Another boat went there a week before you," he said. "They sent a runner back for supplies and were due 2 days ago. No one's seen them since. 5 men, same as your crew. We stayed that night in the harbor, tied between 2 local boats. I tried to sleep, but the floor creaked and shifted beneath me. In the middle of the night, I heard a soft knock at the hull, steady and deliberate. It came from below the waterline, the same sound that had woken me on our first night in the inlet. I held still and listened. The knock stopped, then came again from the other side, as though whatever may had circled us slowly. I woke Samuel. He listened, then whispered, "Don't speak. It remembers voices." We waited until the sound faded. In the morning, the captain ordered us to unload and refit the ship for a southern run. He said nothing about going north again. Samuel left first, walking toward the trail that led inland. Petrov went next, saying he'd find work on a cannery barge. Eli stayed with the Mercy another day, then packed his few things and left without a word. I helped the captain clean the hold. When we were done, he stood at the rail looking toward the horizon. He asked if I had seen what he saw on the beach. I told him I had. He nodded once and said, "Then we won't speak of it again." I agreed. There was nothing to say that would make sense on land. Weeks later, when the Mercy was tied up in Ketchikan for season, I heard of a drift boat found near the southern tip of Prince of Wales. The hull paint matched ours. Inside were 2 fish hooks tied in the pattern we had seen, and a coil of line still wet, though it hadn't rained. The men who found it cut the rope, burned the dory, and let the ashes sink. They said the air around the wreck smelled of salt and musk, but the sea was still. I never went north again after that summer. The captain sold the Mercy to a trader and left for Seattle. Petrov wrote once from Kodiak and said he dreamed of the inlet when fog rolled in. Eli's name appeared on a crew list out of Juneau. The next year, bound for the same coast. That boat never returned. When I hear the wind against a window or the slap of water under a pier, I sometimes think of the voice that called my name from shore. I still remember how it sounded. Familiar, but fundamentally wrong, like words repeated by someone learning how to be human, practicing the patterns and rhythms of speech without truly understanding the meaning beneath them. Some places, as Samuel had said, are for passing only, and when you pass, you keep your voice down. You do not fix your eyes on the trilene. You understand the rules, because the rules are all that stand between the world as you know it and something far older, far deeper, far less forgiving than any human being could comprehend. The inlet is still there, I imagine. The rocks are still in place. The forest still grows along the shores. And somewhere in that water, something waits. Something that learned to speak in voices it borrowed from drowning men. Something that knows our names without our having told them. Something that offers rescue and companionship and comfort, all while learning, ever so slowly, how to be convincing in its mimicry. I have not returned to Alaska. I have not fished those waters again, and I never will. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. Some places once visited claim a portion of one's soul, and some voices once heard echo forever in the spaces between sleep and waking, reminding us that the world is far larger and far stranger than the reasonable mind would prefer to believe. 3 years passed before I saw Petrov again. The years were ordinary enough. I worked various vessels, made decent money, and attempted to construct a life that existed entirely within the realm of the comprehensible and the rational. It was not particularly successful in that last endeavor, but I managed. I was working the docks in San Francisco when a letter arrived addressed to me at the harbor master's office. The postmark was from Kodiak, dated 6 months prior. Petrov's handwriting was neat but unsteady, as though written by someone not entirely in control of his faculties. I opened it with trembling fingers. The letter began ordinarily enough. He described his work, the money he was making, the other men he worked with. He mentioned the cannery barges and spoke about the new steam vessels that were beginning to replace the sailing ships. All of it was mundane, the sort of correspondence one might expect from an old friend making his way in the world. But then his tone shifted. He wrote, "The dreams began during my first winter in Kodiak. Not nightmares, precisely, though they are unpleasant. Rather, they are memories of events that feel more real than waking. I see the inlet as though I am returning to it repeatedly, though my feet never actually leave solid ground. Each time I see it, the forest seems to have moved closer. The trees are crowding in toward the water." He continued, "Last month, I was on a barge moving toward the straits, and a fog came in, the sort of fog that erases the world beyond 50 yards. I heard a whistle, the same whistle we heard that night on the water. 3 notes, then a pause, then 3 more notes. My companions heard nothing. They thought I was imagining things. But I knew that sound, and my hands would not stop shaking for an hour after. Then came the passage that made my blood run cold. Last week, I was at the dock at dusk, and I saw something in the water that I should not have seen. It was a dory, not our dory, but a dory nonetheless, moving through the water with no one aboard it. The oars were in the locks, and they moved as though guided by invisible hands. It passed within 10 yards of where I stood. I want to call out, to warn someone, but I could not make my voice function. The boat moved directly toward a fishing vessel that was preparing to depart from north. I watched it approach, and the crew simply ignored it. They tied it off as though this were the most natural thing in the world, and the next morning they set sail for the inlet." He concluded, "I have not heard what became of them. I am afraid to ask. I am afraid that asking will somehow make it real, or make it worse, if such a thing is possible. I am writing this to tell you that I do not think the matter is finished. I do not think it will ever be finished. The thing we encountered is still there, still learning, still perfecting its ability to mimic us. And I fear that it is not content to remain in one place. I think it is spreading, reaching farther and farther from its inlet, testing boundaries, seeing how far it can extend its influence. When I heard the whistle in the fog, I felt certain that it remembered me specifically, that it knew my name and the sound of my voice, and it was calling me across the water. I am writing to warn you. Do not dismiss what happened. Do not attempt to convince yourself it was illusion or the product of exhaustion. It was real. It is real. And I fear what comes next. The letter ended without further explanation or closing remarks. It simply stopped, as though Petrov had set down his pen in the middle of a thought. I did not respond to the letter. I could not think of anything to say that would be honest or useful. I kept it locked in a chest for nearly a decade before I finally destroyed it by fire, fearing that keeping written record of such things might somehow strengthen whatever connection existed between that place and the world of ordinary men. But I never forgot the warning, and I began to pay attention to the stories that circulated through the fishing communities. Small tales that no one took particularly seriously, anecdotes that were dismissed as the rambling of drunk sailors or the superstitions of simple folk. Stories of boats that appeared where no boat should be. Stories of voices calling from impossible distances. Stories of men who departed for the northern waters and never returned, whose vessels were sometimes found months later bearing cargoes that made no sense. Coils of rope in unrecognizable patterns. Fish hooks arranged in elaborate designs. Creatures that had never been classified by any naturalist. The stories accumulated over years. And I began to wonder, truly wonder, whether Petrov was correct in his assessment. Whether the thing we had encountered was not simply a phenomenon confined to a single inlet on a remote Alaskan coast, but something far more mobile, far more ambitious in its scope. Whether it was, in fact, spreading. 10 years after summer 1902, I found myself, against all my better judgment and conscious intention, booking passage on a fishing vessel bound for Alaska. I cannot fully explain why I did this. There was something unfinished about the matter, some question that my rational mind could not settle, some compulsion that overrode my understanding of danger and self-preservation. The captain of this new vessel, a man named Gregson, competent and unimaginative, asked why an experienced sailor like myself was returning to waters I had once deliberately avoided. I told him it was for money, which was technically true, though not the complete truth. He accepted this explanation without further inquiry. The voyage north was uneventful. The waters were calm. The catches were good. By all conventional measures, it was a successful enterprise. Yet I found myself increasingly anxious as we approached the waters near Prince of Wales Island. My fellow crew members noticed nothing unusual, but I noticed everything. Every shift in the wind, every change in character of the water, every instance of unusual behavior among the wildlife. We were anchored in a small cove, perhaps 15 miles south of the inlet, when I finally saw him. It was dusk. I was standing at the rail, looking toward the shore, when I noticed a figure standing on the rocky beach. He was alone, absolutely motionless, and even at that distance, I recognized the shape and bearing. It was Samuel, but Samuel had departed the Mercy more than a decade earlier. Samuel, to the best of my knowledge, was dead or gone or simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Yet here he stood, perfectly still, looking directly at our vessel. I called out to Captain Gregson. He came to the rail and squinted toward the figure. "There's a man on the beach," I said. "Yes, I see him," the captain replied. Tlingit, probably. Likely want to trade or sell something. "We should not approach him," I said. The words came out more forcefully than I intended. The captain looked at me strangely. "Why not? There's no harm in it." I could not explain. I could not articulate the absolute certainty that had seized me. The knowledge that the figure on the beach was not Samuel, not any longer. It had ever truly been Samuel at all. That what stood there was something wearing Samuel's shape. Something that had learned how to wear it well enough to fool an ordinary observer, but not well enough to deceive someone who had known the real Samuel and had felt the presence of thing that had replaced him. "I have a bad feeling about it," I said finally. Captain Gregson was not a man who trusted bad feelings. He was a man who trusted profit and efficiency and the conventional wisdom of practical commerce. He ordered the dory lowered and instructed 2 crew members to row ashore and make contact with the figure. I watched from the deck as they rowed toward the beach. The figure, the thing wearing Samuel's form, did not move. It simply waited, patient and still, as they approached. They reached the shore and pulled the dory above the wash. They stood and began to walk toward the figure. And then, "And this is what I shall carry to my grave." The figure raised one hand, and the two crew members simply stopped walking. They stood absolutely motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then they turned and began walking back toward the dory with mechanical precision. They rowed back to the vessel without speaking, without being asked, without any conversation. They climbed aboard and began securing the dory. Their faces were blank. Not blank in a way that an ordinary face is blank, but blank in a way that suggested the absence of anyone behind the eyes, as though something interior had simply switched off. Captain Gregson demanded to know what had happened. Neither man responded. They simply stared ahead with expressions of absolute emptiness. One of them, his name was Davies, went below without a word. The other, a younger man named Hutchins, stood at the rail and looked back toward the shore. The figure was still there, still watching us, still perfectly motionless. "Weigh anchor," I said to Captain Gregson. "We must leave this place immediately." "What in God's name are you talking about?" the captain demanded. "We have business here. We're anchored in this cove for the night, and we're not leaving until I decide otherwise." "Captain," I said, and I think he heard something in my voice that suggested this was not mere preference or superstition. "We must leave now, not in the morning, not in an hour. Now!" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Davies and Hutchins. Something in the character of their blank expressions must have penetrated his practical sensibilities, because he nodded once and ordered the anchor weighed. We departed that cove with the sun barely below the horizon, and we did not stop until we reached a large settlement where there were other vessels and people and the ordinary trappings of civilization. It was only then that I learned the full extent of what had occurred. Davies had not merely become vacant. He had become dangerous. When we reached the settlement and he went ashore, the authorities found him wandering the dock at dawn, his clothing torn and his skin scratched as though he'd been in combat with something or someone. He could not speak coherently. When asked his name, he opened his mouth and produced a sound that was not language, a kind of clicking, chirping noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his throat. He was confined to the settlement's small hospital, where he remained completely unresponsive to treatment or communication. Within a week, he had wasted away to an alarming degree, and within 2 weeks he died. The attending physician recorded the cause as complete nervous collapse of unknown origin. Hutchins had fared somewhat better, in that he remained physically healthy, but his mind was fundamentally altered. He would sit for hours and stare at nothing, occasionally muttering things in a language that no one recognized. When forced to eat or engage in basic bodily functions, he would comply, but without any sign of comprehension or will. He was, for all practical purposes, simply gone. His body continued to function, but the consciousness that had once inhabited it had been replaced by something else. Captain Gregson paid for the care out of his own pocket, a gesture that spoke to better instincts than his earlier decisions had suggested. He also, and this was significant, refused to return to Alaskan waters. He sold his vessel and retired to Seattle, where he spent his remaining years, according to those who knew him, troubled by nightmares and persistent anxiety. I did not inquire after him. I did not attempt to contact him or confirm his state of mind. I simply accepted what had happened and moved forward with my life, though forward is perhaps not the correct word for what I did. Rather, I moved sideways into a kind of perpetual evasion, always moving, never settling, always maintaining distance from the north and from the waters that had, in a very real sense, marked me as their own. I am an old man now. I have spent more than 60 years attempting to construct a life that incorporates what happened in 1902 without being entirely consumed by it. It has not been a particularly successful endeavor. What I have come to understand, through decades of reflection and through the careful observation of reports and stories that have reached me from various sources, is that the inlet, the Kushtaka's domain, is not simply a location but a state of being. It exists not in a particular geographic coordinate, but in the boundary between the known world and something far older, far less comprehensible, far more genuinely alien than any simple creature could be. The thing we encountered was learning. When we encountered it, it had learned to speak with voices, to mimic our gestures, to replicate our languages. but it was still in early stages of its education. It did not truly understand what it was mimicking. It was like a child repeating words without comprehension, gradually, through repetition and observation, beginning to grasp the fundamental structures of meaning. In the decades since that summer, I have become convinced that it has continued this process of learning. I have heard reports of vessels that departed from north and arrived at their destination, carrying cargo that made no sense, performing actions that seemed scripted and unnatural. I have heard of fishermen who returned from northern waters fundamentally changed, capable of reproducing fishing knowledge and seamanship, but lacking any of the unconscious humanity that normally accompanies such skill. I have heard of communities where entire families were found dead, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual, their mouths open as though in the process of repeating something, their eyes open as though seeing something that the ordinary world could not contain. And I have heard the whispers, the persistent, impossible to verify, but utterly credible whispers, that suggest the inlet is no longer content to remain in one place, that it is, in some sense, spreading, that the boundary between its domain and the ordinary world is becoming increasingly permeable. Some nights, I wake from dreams in which I hear Samuel's voice calling my name. In these dreams, he is standing at the edge of a body of water, calling me across an impossible distance, asking me to come back, to return to the place we visited, to understand finally what we failed to understand then. I did not answer these calls. I have learned that much, at least, but I fear, truly fear, that the day may come when I can no longer refuse, that the distance between the inlet and the ordinary world may narrow to such a degree that resistance becomes impossible, that the thing we encountered, having spent 60 years learning and observing and slowly, methodically perfecting its ability to mimic and replicate human consciousness, will finally achieve a level of sophistication that allows it to extend its reach beyond isolated coves and remote inlets into the heart of civilization itself. And what happens then? What happens when a thing that has learned to speak perfectly in our voices, that has learned to replicate our gestures and our reasoning, that has learned to construct sophisticated facades of humanity? What happens when such a thing decides that it no longer needs to remain hidden? These are the questions that have haunted me for 60 years. And these are the questions for which I have found no satisfactory answer. All I know with certainty is this: some places are indeed for passing only, and when you pass, you keep your voice down. You do not fix your eyes on the trilene, and you pray, though prayer may be futile, that whatever dwells in the boundary between worlds remains satisfied with the boundaries that have been established and does not decide that those boundaries have become inconvenient. Because if that day ever comes, if that thing ever decides that the entire world is its domain, that every person is a potential voice to learn and replicate, then I fear there will be no safety left. There will be no refuge. There will be only the gradual realization, spreading outward like a stain in water, that the people around us are no longer entirely themselves, that they are wearing human shapes the way that thing wore Samuel's shape on the beach. And by the time that realization becomes universal, it will be far too late to do anything about it. This is my warning, if warning it can be called. This is my testimony, offered not in the expectation that it will be believed, but in the hope that somewhere, somehow, it might reach someone who has also encountered the boundary between worlds and who understands, as I come to understand, that some knowledge, once gained, is a burden that cannot be set down. The inlet still exists. The thing that dwells there still learns. And somewhere in the spaces between sleep and waking, between fog and water, between the known world and the infinite unknown, it is still calling, still remembering voices, still practicing the mimicry of human consciousness. And I am certain that one day it will call successfully